He died like a dog. He died like a coward. The world is now a much safer place.
Hello, I'm Kevin Dusk, and welcome to Rogue Insights. Today, we are going to talk about whether it is true and correct that Iran truly wants to assassinate former United States President and current U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump. In October of this month, current president, who's not running for re-election, as you might know, Joe Biden, made a very significant move in terms of escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran when he instructed the National Security Council to convey a very clear message to Tehran that any attempt to assassinate former President Donald Trump would be seen as an act of war. This warning reflects a broader concern that Iran might be attempting to target Trump in retaliation for the 2020 assassination of General Qassem Soleimani, who was the leader of the IRGC, the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, which Trump authorized while in office and which he was just talking about back then. And you know, some people thought that he was a little abrupt. Let's have another listen.
He died like a dog. He died like a coward. The world is now a much safer place.
Either way, this is Rogue Insights. I'm Kevin Duska. We are a Calgary-based geopolitical risk analysis firm. Someone whose dog died 40 days ago, and who was the inspiration for this company's name. Her name was Rogue. I don't particularly like the way Donald Trump phrased that. My dog had a pretty good death. She died of natural causes, which is apparently quite rare these days. But, yeah, Trump was spiking the football a little bit there. So the warning that Biden gave to Iran is kind of in alignment, the broader Israeli-Iran conflict and the strategy that Biden's been putting forth to avoid full-scale conflict, all the while maintaining deterrence. So given that U.S. intelligence has pointed to Iranian ambitions to avenge the death of Soleimani, notably as other figures in the IRGC continue to be killed by Israel, and as the Iranian political and IRGC establishment are displaying grievances over the killing, this type of assassination attempt would not only escalate regional tensions, but could probably spark a conflict between the U.S. and Iran. So from Iran's perspective, and again, looking back at what happened, Soleimani's assassination was a severe blow to its military and ideological leadership. Soleimani wasn't just a top military commander, but also kind of a symbol of Iran's influence throughout the Middle East. Iranian officials, including Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, all vowed retaliation right after he died. They kind of framed it as a longer-term goal. So while the initial military response just involved a few missile strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq, there's a widespread belief that Iran's desire for revenge is unresolved and that it's personal against Trump and against former CIA Director Mike Pompeo, who is apparently still receiving, I believe, Secret Service protection, if I'm not mistaken, because he is also a target, as they are seen personally being responsible for this. Iran has in the past employed asymmetrical tactics, targeting U.S. allies or using proxy forces to carry out attacks that can't be directly attributed to Tehran. Think of Hezbollah sleeper cells in Europe and the United States. So any assassination attempt on a high-profile figure like Trump, would be a dramatic escalation, even if it was done through those means. Tehran's willingness to consider such an operation, in spite of these risks, kind of demonstrates the very deep anger that prevails within the regime in relation to Soleimani's killing. If we look back at the previous assassination attempts on Trump, to which I believe there has been one serious one where he was grazed along the ear. I mean, if he hadn't moved his head, I don't want to go there. But his ear was injured, and he did get some good PR out of that at the time. I mean, this is, whether or not you agree with President Trump's politics, this is a pretty iconic photo. If Biden hadn't dropped out at the time and Miss Harris, or Vice President Harris, hadn't taken his place, this would still be dominating the news narrative, I would think. But regardless, Iran faces a very complex calculus if it's indeed planning or plotting such an attack. Because carrying out an assassination against the former U.S. president, despite the fact that this kid in Pennsylvania came so close, would involve such a massive U.S. military response, whether it succeeded or failed. So Biden framing such an act as a declaration of war is pretty much the apex of what he could do to deter Iran by making the consequences crystal clear. So in considering whether it wants to assassinate President Trump for real or whether this is just blustering, Iran has to weigh its current geopolitical priorities. It's engaged in direct confrontation with Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, via proxies, with Israel now, and that's apparently going to grow very soon. And the Iranian economy is in the toilet due to U.S. sanctions. We did a previous video in which we talked about the rial and how terrible its performance is due to hyperinflation. So a full-scale military conflict with the U.S. when Iran is still using F-4s and F-14s, not a great idea, considering that like those F-35s can, strike from standoff distance. So Iran is pretty likely to hold back. Despite this rhetoric from hardliners in Tehran, Iran is probably going to opt for less direct forms of retaliation, if anything at all, considering its deep involvement with the Israeli conflict right now. Rather than risk war, Iran could use cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, notably against the Trump election campaign, or use its proxy forces in the region to strike U.S. interests in a more indirect manner, and this would be more consistent with Iran's historical approach to these things, which involves avoiding open conflict while still making sure it sends what it considers to be a powerful message to its enemies. Additionally, Trump's no longer the sitting president, although he could become so again. This complicates the value of this type of assassination from a strategic point of view. It would still be very symbolic in terms of revenge. It wouldn't carry the same weight as it would had he been in office. And moreover, there is a possibility that Tehran is biding its time and waiting for a moment when perhaps Trump is reelected, and retaliation would be more conducive to not triggering a U.S. response because the U.S. would be bogged down with, China. But yeah, it is the assassination of General Qassem Soleimani that has prompted this, as basically this was one of the most defining moments in modern U.S. Iran relations. Soleimani was the head of the Quds Force, which is basically the special forces branch, dark stuff branch of the IRGC. His death was widely mourned throughout the Middle East and beyond Iran's sphere of influence, I would say, because he was responsible for Iran's asymmetric warfare capabilities, and he was widely seen as a symbol of resistance. Iran began way back in 2020 to promise severe retaliation, and it did lead to some missile strikes on U.S. military bases, but there were no American casualties. But Iran did claim that this was only the beginning. Should they assassinate Trump, this would be seen as retribution for Soleimani's death, but it would also be a massive and potent symbol of Iran's ability to strike high-value targets when, let's be real, it's getting absolutely wrecked by Israel right now in relation to its proxies. But given that the Ayatollah has such direct connections with the Revolutionary Guard, which is directly promising revenge for Soleimani's death, it's possible that this might occur outside of the proxy networks that we're so used to seeing. It could even be a direct Quds Force operation. That said, inside Iran, the political landscape is changing. There are hardliners who view Soleimani's death as a national humiliation, and Iran has done some very limited military retaliation since 2020, but there is a very significant faction, which the Ayatollah is beholden to a degree, that suggests that under, natural law, as viewed by their extreme interpretation of Islam, Trump must be killed to bring justice about. And Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been super vocal about seeking justice for Soleimani, the need for a severe response, and he's been basically trying to appeal to Iran's more conservative political base, which does want stronger retaliation. But more pragmatic leaders in Iran, especially those who are not necessarily tied to the religious factions, view diplomacy and negotiations as the only way out of the quagmire that Iran currently finds itself in. Given the fragility of the Iranian economy, domestic instability, the rest of the country's leadership, including the president, is trying to maintain domestic stability, and a move targeting Trump that would trigger such a U.S. response would be inherently destabilizing. Also, Iran's regional ambitions, notably, exerting control in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, if it ever comes back, will play a significant role in its decision-making. Soleimani was basically the linchpin in expanding Iranian influence throughout the region in relation to these proxy forces, and his death has arguably weakened Iran's leverage. Iran has continued consolidating its power through non-state actors like Hezbollah and other pro-Iranian militias, but if Iran attempted an assassination on Trump, it would risk losing control over these proxy dynamics, being isolated by countries in the region, even those who've more recently warmed at least a bit prior to the Israel conflict to diplomatic solutions like Saudi and the UAE. The biggest strategic risk, though, is that should it try to assassinate Trump, it would face a massive full-scale U.S. response. So this would target key Iranian military sites, potentially oil sites, nuclear program, missile capabilities, and the leadership is aware of this, and that complicates their decision-making because Tehran has pretty decent, if not formidable, military capabilities for the region, but it is no match for the full might of the U.S. military, let alone the Israelis, as we can see from ongoing attacks. And it's also likely that the international community would see key players like Russia and China be less willing to defend Iran, something they're currently doing, if they directly engaged in the assassination of an American president. So what's the likelihood of Iran trying to assassinate Trump? It's mostly bluster. The likelihood remains unclear, but historically Iran has acted through proxies, is engaged in asymmetric warfare, covert operations, and cyber attacks, and it has not really attacked enemies like the U.S. directly. Even though there is some evidence that Iran has been involved in recent plots against high-profile U.S. officials, and that it might be seeking to settle old scores. So, for example, in 2022, the U.S. Justice Department had stated that members of the IRGC were trying to assassinate former National Security Advisor John Bolton as part of this revenge framework. It's unclear to which degree Iran itself sees this as being rational. So I would anticipate that Iran is going to opt for a more covert and indirect form of retaliation. So we're likely to see cyber attack. This is if they're not decimated by Israel. But cyber attacks, Iran has a pretty decent cyber warfare program. It's previously been used to disrupt critical infrastructure in adversary countries. For example, Iranian-linked cyber groups have been accused of attempting to hack U.S. electoral systems, financial institutions, etc. So a large-scale cyber attack, by Iranian standards anyway, could be retaliation that would allow it to avoid direct military confrontation. It could also engage in proxy attacks on U.S. interests in the Middle East. The Conoco oil fields base in Syria, manned by U.S. forces, is already regularly attacked by Iranian proxies. But a larger scale attack, not as likely by Hezbollah, considering it's being decapitated by Israel, but by one of the Shia militias in Iraq or Syria against a U.S. diplomatic facility or U.S. base is not out of the question. Iran could also, again, should it not get wrecked by Israel, try to target U.S. allies like Israel or Saudi Arabia, but it's not going too well with Israel right now because they consider them the key enablers of U.S. policy in the Middle East. But, again, while attacking these countries wouldn't cross the red line that Biden just set in relation to Trump, it might set or cross Israel's red line, which has apparently been crossed many times already. So there are severe constraints on Iran's actions. The existing economic sanctions and the risk of domestic political instability growing more significant are the most important ones. Internal pressures against the regime are growing. Widespread protests over socioeconomic conditions and corruption have taken place. So with this growing public dissatisfaction against the government, the Iranians are likely to be reluctant to escalate tensions with the U.S., given that the ongoing conflict with Israel is already going to make things hard enough on them. There's very little reason to believe at the end of the day that despite Iran's leadership's bluster, that there's going to actually be a tangible decision made to assassinate Donald Trump. The rhetoric from Tehran, when coupled with covert actions against other U.S. officials, shows that Iran is seeking ways to retaliate, but it's very unlikely that it would target Trump himself or one of the other decision makers involved. With Biden having set this red line, and with Trump or Harris likely to take it even further, it's more likely that Iran is going to stick to the long game of patience and covert operations and wait for the right opportunity to hit the U.S., give it a nosebleed, but without really receiving a disproportionate U.S. response by its own consideration. So what's next? Well, U.S. intelligence is just going to continue monitoring Iranian activities. The world is going to watch to see how Tehran navigates this alongside the Israeli conflict, alongside the destruction of its proxies in the form of Hezbollah and Hamas. And this is going to draw some attention to Trump. But with Iran being so bogged down with Israel right now, the broader question of how Iran is going to seek justice for Soleimani's death is likely to remain unresolved for the foreseeable future. This is Kevin Duskett, president of Prime Rogue Inc. Please drop us a subscribe, a like, leave a comment, share this with a friend, a frenemy, an enemy, anyone. You can't share it with Qassem Soleimani again. And check out the books that we drop in the description. But if I still have it here, let's have Donald Trump play us out one more time, just because it's a very strange clip.
He died like a dog. He died like a coward. The world is now a much safer place.